sleigh bells jingling, ring, ting-a-ling-a-ling. I'm on to lovely weather for a sleigh ride together with you. Snow is falling and friends are calling.
You want to find out who Professor Katz is, then you yourself want to do the due diligence of tracking him down and getting his information yourself. We're not going to give it to you.
So this inspired me to start taking a closer look at the emails which Kelly Richardson had showed from Brown's correspondence with Katz, both the excerpts that he put in the foreground and the screenshots he used as background. Richardson's video showed 5 emails, the first being Brown's initial email to Katz from December 3rd at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I want to note the dates and times as they are going to be relevant. And by the way, it was on the morning of December 3rd that the first video showing how Boonis was misrepresented came out. It was later that afternoon that Brown wrote his first email to Katz, almost as if as a reaction to the video that had come out about Boonis. But remember the time of that first email, 1:30 p.m. Then they showed Katz's reply from the same day at 2:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Katz's reply to Brown came 38 minutes after Brown sent his email. This is going to be relevant later. Brown wrote to Katz, and Katz replied 38 minutes later. Keep that in mind. Then they showed Brown's response to Katz's reply at 2:29 p.m. Eastern. Then they showed Katz's second reply at 3:12 p.m. Eastern. And then the fifth and final email they showed was another reply from Katz the next morning, December 4th, at 7:53 a.m. Eastern. As we looked closely at those emails, we noticed similarities in writing style. In my experience, what is typical in academic circles is you open an email with your greeting or salutation, and then separate that from the body of the email which follows with a line break, which is to say, moving the text that's to follow down a couple of lines by hitting your enter key a couple of times, or at least separate it with some sort of punctuation. Now, Brown will at times write emails and even social media posts which begin with a greeting and then launch right into text without starting a new line or even employing any sort of punctuation, like a period or at least a comma. And I found it interesting that the same style surfaces in a couple of Katz's emails as well, a style which in my experience is uncommon in academic circles. For example, on your screen, you see Brown's email from 2:29 p.m. At the bottom, which begins, quote, "Thanks for your response, Professor. I've attached a picture," end quote, etc. Notice how there is no line break or even punctuation between that opening thanks and the self-reference which follows. And Katz's reply is above. From 43 minutes later, he opens with the same style. Quote, "Thanks for these photos, Williams. I must say," end quote, etc. Again, there is no line break or even punctuation separating that opening thanks and the self-reference which follows. So too, when we compare Brown's initial email from December 3rd at 1:30 p.m. to the last email from Katz, which was shown on the email from December 4th at 7:53 a.m., Brown opens with his greeting and then begins a new sentence, "My name is William Brown," on the same line, starting with a lowercase letter and no punctuation separating that new sentence from the greeting which preceded it. So too, Katz's reply opens, quote, "Good morning, William. Regarding your last question," end quote, etc. There's no line break or even punctuation after the greeting, and what would presumably be a new sentence, yet again, starts with a lowercase letter. Now, at this point, one might say this is simply a function of both participants in the correspondence rushing their emails. And, I would at least agree that the similar writing styles and similar approaches to punctuation between Katz and Brown by themselves would not make for a conclusive case in favor of Faithfull's aforementioned suggestion. But at this point, I was starting to feel as though the curious coincidences, the curiosities, were starting to pile up a bit. Then I took another look at this YouTube community post, which Brown had put up on December 3rd, after the first video, publicizing Boonis's actual position had come out. In that YouTube community post, Brown shared a screenshot of Katz's first reply to him. I noticed the 38M in the top right corner, meaning that at the time Brown took the screenshot, his initial email was 38 minutes old. Remember that Brown sent his first email to Katz at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, and Katz's reply came back at 2:08 p.m. Eastern. For Brown's initial email to be 38 minutes old when he took this screenshot, it means that Brown had opened Katz's reply, read it, and took a screenshot all within a minute of it hitting his inbox, which is to say basically within seconds. Now, I admit that's possible. One could say that perhaps he had his phone in his hand when he received the email and the notification immediately drew his attention to it, and within mere seconds he saw the gravity of the reply and felt it was important to take a screenshot. That's possible, but how likely is it? At the very least, this is another one of those curious coincidences. This is another one of these curiosities that's piling up. And we had noticed before that while they did not share Katz's full mail address, his full email address, what they did show revealed that the portion before the arroba or the @ symbol was not some permutation of his name, as is typically the case with academics' emails, professors. Rather, it was the phrase Hebrew language. And whatever the domain was, it was a .com, not a .edu. Now, admittedly, there's nothing impossible about that. An academic can have a private email separate from the one his university provides him with, but it is at least a bit curious. In a vacuum, it's nothing, but against the backdrop of the various other curiosities, it becomes a bit more interesting. Now, if I can segue for a moment, I want to note that in his coverage of the controversy over the email sent to Bunis, Kelly Richardson declared on more than one occasion that Bunis, in his reply to the relevant author whom Richardson had focused on, that Bunis had also BCC'd or blind copied me. Now, that's not quite accurate. He did not blind copy or BCC me, rather he copied or CC'd me. And so too, he copied William Brown. The reason why I went on this segue now is because when Brown replied to all, he copied me as well, which would have been impossible were I blind copied. As a result, I received an email from Brown. And what I received was his reply to Bunis and the man who had mentioned his students with Israelite leanings. With that in mind, we decided to run an experiment. While we didn't know Katz's email address, we guessed that if it was, actually Brown writing these emails, then it might be a hastily thrown together email address. And working with that hypothesis, we thought that as Brown uses Yahoo for his own main email account, he might have likewise created a Yahoo account for his Katz persona, if that is, he was the author of Katz's emails. So I sent an email to HebrewLanguage@yahoo.com. Now, and immediately after that, I posted an admittedly cheeky Facebook post showing a screenshot of the email I sent, which included a garbage or non-existent email address, which I blind copied, and I'll share a link to that Facebook post in the video description. Now, the point was to convey and record that we were anticipating that a reply from Katz might show features similar to the email I received from Brown. But so too, another point of BCCing the garbage or non-existent email address was that I should immediately get a bounced back error message saying that email did not exist. But if we did get that, yet we didn't get a corresponding bounce back, error message for the Yahoo account, we would know that a HebrewLanguage@yahoo.com email address did in fact exist. Sure enough, what we, sent the BCC to got a bounce back, but the Yahoo account did not. So we knew that the Yahoo account did exist. HebrewLanguage@yahoo.com was a real email address. That said, here's the email that I sent to that Yahoo account. Quote, "Greetings, are you Richard Katz? I recently saw a video about a professor named Richard Katz who had analyzed some pictures of markings on church pews from Georgia and concluded that discernible Hebrew was found therein. If that was you, might I ask some questions about that? Sincerely, AA." End quote. And then there's a footnote at the end linking to the relevant video showing the email. Much to our glee, we received a reply from that email address. However, before I read that email, I want to return briefly to this previously mentioned YouTube community post from Brown. I want to look at this YouTube community post just so you can get a bit more of a sense of Brown's writing style and to take that with you into the look at the reply we received from Richard Katz. So starting with the second sentence at the end of the first line, the YouTube community post reads as follows, quote, "See, for us, this has always been about our family and the church history, and this isn't a debate. For us, This is about bringing a resolution to all who need it, end quote. Notice the portion which reads, for us, this is about bringing a resolution, end quote, is that portion is presumably a new thought. It could have been its own sentence. At the very least, it should have been preceded by some sort of punctuation. Now, as a disclaimer, this is not intended to disparage Brown's writing style, but rather only to give you a sense of how he writes. Aside from that, listen to this next sentence, which starts in the middle of the 5th line of this YouTube community post. Quote, see, the first presentation was only to set up the second once. You see the hand of those who oppose, and now that they've shown their hand, the proof is on them to prove this linguistic scholar wrong who definitive said it's not Arabic, end quote. It's a bit of a, how can I put this? It's a long sentence. It's somewhat of a cumbersome sentence. It's the most polite way I can put it. And keep that style of writing in mind, as now I'm going to read the email from Katz. I'll intersperse a few comments along the way. The email begins as follows, quote, thank you for emailing me. I'm Professor Katz, and I'm fully aware and very familiar with the video link you've attached concerning First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, as well as other videos recording the subject. I've received several emails. Many were upset regarding my conclusion and findings of a discernible language on the pews in Georgia, end quote. Now, let me stop here for a moment. Notice the line which reads, quote, I've received several emails, and the line, quote, many were upset regarding my conclusion. Notice that those two lines are presumably two separate thoughts, yet there is no punctuation separating them. This is a feature of Brown's writing. Also, as we go through this, note how this email conveniently hits every point which Brown would want a scholar in his favor to hit. So with that in mind, returning to the text of the email, I'll start again with that last sentence, which I had read in part. Quote, I've received several emails. Many were upset regarding my conclusion and findings of a discernible language on the pews in Georgia. Not to say that that's your position, but I feel it's best to share with you, like I shared with others regarding my conclusion, and also due to my schedule and projects I'm involved in, I don't have the free time in my schedule to go into full details regarding the breakdown and process, end quote. Note that that's a single sentence, and it is somewhat reminiscent of that last sentence I just read from the YouTube community post. Aside from that, conveniently, the professor preemptively informs me that he's too busy to get into the details of his findings. So, pointing to the precise markings where the relevant Hebrew terms are found might not be possible at this time. That's, it's sort of a device to rule out showing where the alleged Hebrew terms appear. Now, there are only two sentences left in the body of the email. The first sentence is short, while the second sentence meanders in a way which is indicative of Brown's writing style. Here, listen to this. Quote, let me start by saying this, and I hope this answers your questions, period. William Brown didn't misrepresent or misquote my findings of a discernible language on the pews. In fact, upon his request, I gave him permission to share my conclusion regarding the pews. My field of study and expertise brought me to the conclusion that Solitreo and Hebrew block letters are on the pews based upon several high-resolution images of the pews that were sent to me by William Brown, period. Best wishes, Richard Katz, PhD, end quote. By the way, did you notice that he capitalized the H in PhD? Honestly, I think it's highly unlikely that any scholar who has actually earned a doctorate in philosophy would capitalize the H in PhD. Rather, they'd leave it lowercase. However, who does write PhD that way? William Brown, and we actually have examples of that. Let's turn to that infamous Boom Church panel discussion, which took place back on the 22nd of November. And I'm going to pick it up at about the 1 hour, 7 minute mark. In a portion where he says he reached out to a student at Tel Aviv University to ask them to reach out to one of their professors for help in deciphering the pews. Here, take a look at this.
So I just reached out to a brother that I know who's a student at Tel Aviv University because I knew that we needed to get this. So I inboxed him on Facebook. I blurred his name because of the fact that I don't want people harassing him. Plus, he's involved in politics in Israel. So I asked him, I say, listen, do you know anybody at the school or whatnot that can, decipher this, look at it or whatnot. And, he responded back to me. He was going to send it over to one of his, professors and try to find someone.
Honestly, I must confess, I'm even wondering about the identity of that alleged student as well. But that's a discussion for another time. The relevant point is the text in blue, the blue block of text on the left, is the message that William Brown sent to that alleged student. And I'd like to zoom in and focus on the way that he spelled PhD, in which he clearly capitalizes the H. So this is another thing that Brown and Katz have in common. Small thing, but worth noting. Anyway, let's get back to that email. Now, I imagine that those of you who have some experience with academia might feel some doubts about the idea of that being written by a college professor. On the other hand, however, others could argue that maybe Katz rushed his email, hence why it reads that way. Or some might even propose that English is not Katz's first language, or at least that such a writing style might not be implausible for an academic who primarily moves within a Hebrew-speaking paradigm or environment. So we can just say that the form is another one of those curiosities. There's a lot of similarities between the way Brown writes and Richard Katz writes. But putting that, all before us and letting that sit in the backdrop, now I'd like to share what I consider the most significant piece of evidence. As I alluded to earlier, when Brown replied to both Bunis and the man who had written to Bunis mentioning Israelites, Brown also copied me. On your screen is that email from December 3rd. Notice the 3 dots at the top right corner of the email. As a feature on Gmail, if you click on those dots, you get a drop-down menu. And among the options in that menu is one which reads Show Original. When you click on that, you receive more data about the email. And this is the data for the email that William Brown sent me on December 3rd. Feel free to pause the video and look it over. Now, here's the email which Richard Katz sent me on December 16th, so 13 days later. Once again, I can click the 3 dots at the top right corner and get the drop-down menu and choose the option which reads Show Original. And here's the relevant data for the email which Katz sent me. Now, we can put the 2 results side by side for a comparison. First, note the SPF IPs are identical. Now, as this is part of a sender policy framework, the relevant IP address reflects that both messages were sent via Yahoo. It pertains to a Yahoo server, one of many Yahoo servers. However, it is highly unlikely that 2 people in different continents would wind up with the exact same IP across all 4 sets of numbers. I checked the SPF IP for various other emails I received from Yahoo accounts, and none of them matched like that. None of them were exact in the way these 2 are. I also sent an email to myself from a Yahoo account and found that my own SPF IP changes, for example, when I send it from my phone using my home Wi-Fi and when I alternatively send it using my mobile data instead. It's not impossible for these 2 people to have the same SPF IP, but as I said, it's highly unlikely. And moving on from that, notice that both Brown and Katz wrote from the same device, apparently a Samsung Galaxy using the Android 9 operating system. At this point, I'm sorry, but there are just too many coincidences. It seems clear to me that the best conclusion is that the emails from Katz were written by Brown himself. Recalling first the situation with Bunis, and now noting this situation with Katz, ask yourself this question. If the scholars were so firmly on their side, why would they need to badly misrepresent one scholar and then totally fabricate another scholar? Amazingly, in some of their subsequent panel discussions, they seem to almost give some insight into what might have motivated such a move. It strikes me as insight into the psychology behind this move. Consider these interesting clips.
It was crazy because when me and you were talking, I'm like, man, it's this other professor I'm going to email, and man, I'm hoping that by today, because me and you have been talking about the whole plan of the video, you was, getting ready to drop it and things like that. And I'm like, man, I pray that this guy, respond back.
So back on December 3rd, they were put in a position where at least one of them, William Brown, was hoping and praying for another scholar to come through where Bunis fell short.
And it was like, man, I think it was like maybe 3 or 4 hours I think me and you talked together. I was like, yo, I just got an email. And then it was almost kind of like the things that we were talking about. Like, hey, we want to make sure that we get some, solid, no vague, gray, response, anything that they can't use. We don't want to try to. So I kind of pressed them. I think me and Benel was texting too.
This time around, they didn't want to try to build a case off of something vague like they did with Bunis. Rather, they needed something more solid and definitive.
So I was like, listen, are you sure? Are you saying this? Is this what you're saying? Are you absolutely, just in case we have to pull those receipts or whatnot. And when he came back and said he's definitively saying that it's not Arabic, I was like, we don't even have to have the conversation about any type of social experiments or any type of language experimentations. That's just off the table, period. It's a definitive response.
Just as they were hoping Bunis could provide the definitive response which ends the debate, so too here, they wanted something definitive. However, this time, with this new scholar, they needed it to be far more substantive than what they got from Bunis. And especially fun and interesting is this next comment from Kelly Richardson.
What's cool here is when you see this portion of it, when he came back, he said here, thanks for these photos, William. I must say, looking at these photos, the old cursive handwriting of the Judeo-Spanish language seems quite clear. Also, there are other characters on the pews of cursive Hebrew used in Israel today. By the looking of the writings, the pews couldn't have been written by the same person. Remember when we was going through, I was like, man, he must have been eavesdropping on our conversations. Because remember I said that to you.
Now, I have no idea if Kelly Richardson knew Brown was writing the emails from Katz. And from that clip, I'm open to the possibility that Richardson did not know. What Katz wrote reflected their earlier private conversations to such a degree that Richardson himself had to joke that it was almost as if the author of those emails was privy to those conversations. Well, I'd say that in hindsight, one is tempted to say, yeah, the author of Katz's emails really did hear those private conversations that Richardson had with Brown. And the reason that Katz had access to those conversations because Katz was one of the participants in that conversation.
Another piece of evidence that gave away that the purported professor was William Brown was his inability to tell that the word B'nai in the Hebrew phrase, B'nai Yisrael, is plural, not singular. And yet, the gentleman in question translated B'nai Yisrael as son of Israel rather than sons of Israel. This is a mistake that one would expect from a person who is unfamiliar with Hebrew grammar, not a professor of Hebrew. Food for thought. On that note, we look forward to the comments of others.